The Japanese bombers never saw them coming. Low over the jungle-covered islands of Bougainville, two Mitsubishi Betty bombers pushed through the morning sky, escorted by 6-0 fighters. The formation looked safe. Then, from far beyond the horizon, came the sound of engines, twin engines, fast, closing. 14 American P-38 Lightnings were racing toward them. They had flown hundreds of miles across the Pacific, far beyond the normal range of most fighters, and they had one target. The Japanese pilots didn't know it yet, but the Americans weren't hunting an ordinary bomber formation, they were hunting the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The P-38s dropped toward the Japanese formation, the Zeros turned, guns opened. And suddenly, the quiet Pacific sky became a storm of tracers, diving fighters, and burning aircraft. One of the American pilots closed on a Betty. He fired, the Lightning's concentrated nose-mounted guns hammered the bomber, the Japanese aircraft erupted. Seconds later, another bomber was falling toward the jungle. The mission was over almost as quickly as it had begun, but the significance of what had just happened went far beyond the destruction of two aircraft, because the P-38 Lightning was proving that American fighters could fight the Japanese in a completely different way. The Japanese had built much of their early Pacific air power around maneuverability. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could turn extraordinarily tightly. It was light, agile, and dangerous in the hands of an experienced pilot. American pilots who tried to fight it on the Zero's terms could pay for the mistake with their lives, but the P-38 was not designed to fight that way. It was something entirely different. Two engines sat on twin booms, connected by a central nacelle carrying the cockpit and weapons. And in the nose were 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. There was no propeller blocking the guns. No need to fire through a spinning disc. When a P-38 pilot lined up his target, the weapons were pointing directly at it. The result was devastating. But firepower was only part of the equation. The Lightning could fly fast. It could climb. It could operate at high altitude, and most importantly in the enormous Pacific theater, it had range. That range changed what American commanders could ask their fighter pilots to do. The Pacific was not a battlefield measured in miles. It was measured in hundreds of miles of open ocean. A fighter could win a dogfight and still be useless if it could not reach the fight in the first place. The P-38 could, and that made it one of the most important American fighters in the Pacific. But the Lightning had weaknesses. Its size made it less nimble than the Zero. At low speed, an experienced Japanese fighter pilot could still turn inside it. The P-38's supercharged engines could also create problems in certain conditions, particularly during abrupt maneuvers and dives. So American pilots learned something crucial: they didn't have to turn with the Zero. They could fight differently. A P-38 could attack with speed, fire its concentrated weapons, and use its power to escape. Instead of staying in a slow circle with a lighter Japanese fighter, the American pilot could turn altitude and speed into weapons of their own. Dive, fire, climb, reposition, strike again. It was a different philosophy of air combat, and as American pilots gained experience, the Lightning became increasingly dangerous. Then came April 18, 1943. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications. They discovered that Admiral Yamamoto was scheduled to fly to Bougainville. Yamamoto was not simply another Japanese officer. He was one of Japan's most senior naval commanders and one of the architects of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now American planners faced a remarkable opportunity, but there was a problem. Yamamoto's aircraft would be far from American bases, too far for most fighters. The mission required an aircraft with extraordinary range. The P-38 was the answer. 14 Lightnings were sent out. The route was carefully planned. The pilots flew low over the Pacific, trying to avoid detection. They knew that if they arrived too early, the Japanese might turn away. If they arrived too late, Yamamoto would be gone. 400s of miles, the P-38s flew toward their target. No dramatic dogfight. No massive formation of bombers, just ocean, engines, and a shrinking margin for error. Then the Japanese aircraft appeared. 2 Betty bombers. 60 escorts. The Americans had found them. The P-38s attacked. The Japanese formation broke. Zeros turned toward the American fighters, but the Lightnings were already moving. The Americans had the advantage of surprise and speed. The bombers were the priority. the P-38s drove into the formation, machine guns and cannon fire ripped into the Japanese aircraft. One Betty went down, then the other. Yamamoto's aircraft crashed into the jungle. The mission had succeeded, but it had not been effortless. American pilot Raymond Hine was lost during the engagement, and the Japanese escort fighters had fought back. This was not an effortless American victory. It was a carefully planned interception made possible by intelligence, navigation, pilot skill, and an aircraft capable of flying the required distance. The P-38 had allowed American planners to reach a target that would otherwise have been extremely difficult to attack. And that was the real impact of the lightning. It didn't make the Zero disappear. It didn't suddenly make Japanese pilots helpless. Instead, it changed the kind of fight American pilots could choose. The P-38 gave them reach. It gave them firepower. It gave them speed. And it gave experienced pilots the ability to attack Japanese aircraft without necessarily accepting the close-range turning battle the Zero was built for. Across the Pacific, Lightning pilots began exploiting these advantages. They attacked bombers, they intercepted fighters, they escorted American aircraft, they struck Japanese positions. And they became particularly valuable in the long-distance combat that defined the Pacific. The aircraft's twin engines also provided an advantage that could mean the difference between life and death over hundreds of miles of ocean. If one engine failed, the other could sometimes keep the aircraft airborne. For a pilot far from an American base, that mattered. A fighter that could limp home was better than one that became a grave beneath the Pacific. The results became extraordinary. The P-38 became one of the principal American fighters in the Southwest Pacific. Its pilots included some of America's highest-scoring aces. Richard Bong would eventually become the highest-scoring American ace of the war, credited with 40 aerial victories. Thomas Maguire would become another legendary P-38 ace, with 38 victories. These men did not win their battles simply because they were flying a powerful aircraft. They learned how to use it. They learned when to attack, when to disengage, when to dive, when to climb, and, perhaps most importantly, when not to fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. That lesson was brutally important. Zero could be terrifying when allowed to dictate the fight, but the P-38 could dictate a different fight. One based on speed, energy, firepower, and distance. By the later years of the Pacific War, the balance of air power was shifting dramatically. American aircraft were becoming more numerous. American pilots were gaining experience. Japanese veteran pilots were increasingly difficult to replace, and American fighters such as the P-38 were operating with growing confidence. The Lightning was not invincible. No aircraft was. But it had become something Japanese aviation could not afford to ignore. A P-38 appearing on the horizon could mean a bomber formation was about to be attacked. A Japanese aircraft trying to escape could find a Lightning still closing behind it, and a target hundreds of miles from an American base could suddenly be within reach. That was the Lightning's greatest weapon, not simply its guns. Its ability to appear where the enemy believed American fighters could not. The story of the P-38 in the Pacific, then, is not simply the story of an American fighter shooting down Japanese aircraft. It is the story of a different approach to air combat. The Zero was built around lightness and maneuverability. The P-38 brought something else. Power. Range. Speed. Firepower. And the ability to strike deep across an ocean battlefield where distance itself was often the greatest enemy. On that morning over Bougainville, 14 American Lightnings crossed hundreds of miles of Pacific sky and found their target. 2 Japanese bombers disappeared into the jungle. One of them carried Admiral Yamamoto. The interception became one of the most famous fighter missions of the Pacific War. But perhaps its most important message was simpler. The Japanese could no longer assume that distance meant safety. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, twin engines might already be approaching. And by the time the Lightning appeared, it could already be too late.